Good morning, beautiful people of the internet. And yes, that is the first time you have heard that this year, and you are most welcome. Welcome back to 2024. The year, I am certain, is full of opportunity, full of more wars, because why not? That's what the humanity seems to be good at. Full of more economic turbulence, which is going to be great for Adam's 9,000 word espouses every Sunday. And it's going to be full of, like I said, to start off with, more and more opportunity. So, you are welcome to join us again. We are here pretty much every Sunday. We look forward to seeing you all. We love spending this time with you all. And what we'll do is we're going to kick off with Adam as we normally do with his Cliff Note version of his Sunday supplement. And then we'll just get around and start destroying the world as it is, wars, politics, money, religion. We'll just see where life takes us. With any luck, someone will put a brilliant comment in the chat and we get to discuss that. So if you do have something you want to start the year off with, something you're thankful for, a goal that you're trying to achieve and you're putting it out there to make it real, whatever that may be, you're most welcome. And we will highlight it on the screen and we'll discuss it. So we'll let Adam take it away. But Happy
And
New
with
Year
any
and
luck,
welcome
we'll
to
also get
2024.
Helen to join us with her resolving her technical difficulties.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jay, for a barn-burning introduction, as always. Absolutely agree with all of that. And I've shortchanged everyone this week with a mere 4,000 words, so not so enthusiastic. But you can't always squeeze in the full dissertation length every week, can you? It's reasonably demanding. But when you would think you would have a fairly quiet week in the first week of the year, and I know a lot of people haven't necessarily got back to full speed yet because it's been school holidays for a lot of the country, and there's been other things on their mind. If you live anywhere near the River Trent, there's been other things on your mind as well, in terms of preserving your house and your car and other things that a lot of the rest of us haven't had to think about. So, been a ropey old week for weather. I guess it's God bless climate change, and I'm sure I'm going to get on the soapbox at some point in the supplement this year about all of that, but not this week because I focused on quite a few pretty significant macro releases and a real change of direction, because all the news in December was pretty bearish for the economy, which was generally good for those who are sweating the bond yields and the swap rates, as all the borrowers are who listen to us and who read the supplement. So it was all different this week, where actually the economic news looked a lot more positive. The PMIs, which are the purchasing managers indices, looked a lot more favourable than they have done for a while, especially the services one. And I took the opportunity to remind everyone that the services PMI and the services element of the economy, services inflation contributes 47% of CPI. So I know that the narrative at the moment is that inflation is quashed and it's going down, and that's all wonderful. I'm just not quite on that bus yet, because services inflation last month was still 6.3%. And if you take the basic maths and take half of that, that's contributing 3.15 to CPI. If you then throw in the mixer that we've got some really significant rises in minimum wage, pensions and benefits this year, I'm struggling to see how this sudden path to under 2% and then an orderly inflation trading range is going to come along. Could be wrong, but of course, all the risks remain to the upside. And the other thing that's wobbled the markets this week, of course, is some bits going on, closure of the Suez Canal, concerns around that, and that being inflationary, as it has been in the past, especially when there were already supply chain disruptions. Although from a quantum perspective, it doesn't have that much impact on global GDP in reality, but markets hate uncertainty, and that's what they react to. And of course, assassination in Iran of a Hamas deputy leader, which has been cited as a potential reason for the conflict there to escalate further, which can obviously have a knock-on effect for global oil, which has a knock-on effect for inflation, apart from anything else. One of the things that hasn't made the headlines at all is the fact that January's rolled round and the price cap, which is now done quarterly rather than half yearly, because of how much volatility there was around the time of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, has gone back up again. So electricity and gas are now more expensive than they were And again, I'd expect that to be a little bit inflationary. Probably what hasn't been understood very well, because we tend to get obsessed with certain metrics. And of course, you can't focus on the 1,000 plus metrics that there are in the economy every week. I'd love to do that, but no one's got the capacity to be able to do that. So you forget that actually what's been happening, like we point to food, there was some food inflation articles this week as a good example. 6.7% up December to December. Still sounds very high. But of course, when you put into context that if we went back about 9 or 10 months, we were seeing prints like 18 and 19% up year on year. What's actually happened in that interim period is food has disinflated, right? It's actually deflated. It has got cheaper from its peak prices, right? It's still more expensive than it was 12 months ago, and it's still more expensive than it was 2 years ago. There's no two ways about it. But it has actually been coming down, and that's been having a negative impact on CPI, right? That will stop relatively quickly, because there won't be much room, especially as when you think about it, the distribution and the preparation of food at most parts of the supply chain is dominated by low wage paid workers who are getting a 9.8% wage increase in April, right? That is a known fact that is not going to change. So this sort of deflationary impact that's been coming a little bit from commodity prices, a little bit from energy prices, again, that looks to be over, and some from the food prices is taken away. And this is why we look at the core inflation side of things. But that's just a little insight into that side of things. But I also talked about the money supply this week, because I tend to avoid the money supply conversation, because it generally has it's a bit like talking about Rangers versus Celtic or something like that. There's these two very entrenched camps of why inflation works in the way that it does and whether the money supply is important or not. And like most of these sorts of arguments, in reality, the truth is somewhere in the middle, or at least somewhere on that spectrum. So one school would contend it's not important at all, how much money there is in the economy. The other school of thought would say, of course it's important, don't be stupid. Money finds a home within the economy, and when there's more of it, it pushes prices up. And of course, you'd have to have some sympathy for that, because ultimately, what did we see during COVID? Well, one side explained it as massive cost push inflation, because prices went up because, apart from anything else, production stopped or there were significant disruptions in supply chains. The other side said, no, all this money was pumped into the economy and people find something to do with that money. And I do think there's an element of truth in both ways of looking at it. But the money supply is down for the 5th month in a row, which is definitely one of the things that's helping inflation come under control. It's still about 22% above where it was on the 1st of January 2020, which is miraculously, coincidentally, very close to the amount of inflation that there's been since the 1st of January 2020. So read into that what you will. I am sympathetic to the Milton Friedman school, and if anybody wants to fall down a YouTube rabbit hole at any stage, I'd highly recommend looking at the Free to Choose network and some of Milton's talks, because the stuff he was saying 30 and 40 years ago is still incredibly relevant. And it's a real tragedy that he didn't live to see the pandemic, because he would have had some incredible things to say that I'm sure would have been bang on the money very early on. And he would have joined very, very few of the larger forecasting houses, big banks and economic commentators who I've given a bit of short shrift to this week. Halifax is the one that's taken the bulk of my wrath, because they released their house price index for the year, 1.7% up on the year. Didn't mention, for some reason, that 12 months ago they predicted an 8% fall in house prices in 2023. So they got that obviously abjectly wrong. And I think being 10% out is pretty rubbish when you're one of the biggest banks in the country. And I think not coming back and saying that is pretty disgraceful. I myself predicted a 3 to 5% drop, measuring on the ONS statistics, because I think I know they're the most accurate apart from anything else. It looks like the ONS print might settle down to about 2% down by the time the year washes through. That'll take a couple of months to come through. I'm still annoyed that wasn't within my range, of course, because I'm a bit of a perfectionist, but it wasn't too far off and didn't seem too unreasonable. So Halifax have opened 2024 with another bearish prediction of 4% drop for the year. Zoopla are saying -2%. I have a a deep level of respect for Richard Donnell at Zoopla, so have to take anything he lets get past his editorial gaze pretty seriously, I think. Although I disagree, and I think we're going to see house prices move upwards for the year. But part of this is predicated on my theory that inflation is not yet quashed. And even if it is mostly quashed, I still think we're going to see some wage rises. So if you can explain to me how we're going to see some significant wage rises without that being inflationary, I look forward to everybody's answers on a postcard. I regularly make appeals in the supplement these days for people to prove me wrong, tell me where I'm going wrong, educate me. And I'd love people to do that at least just put some theories forward that we can talk about. It's an interesting one. And then beyond that, I've really, rather than go into a full thesis length bunch of data analysis this week, I've just looked at the last 2 years worth of stats for net migration, because that would probably fit into Jay's incendiary categories that he opened the talk with, in which we could upset everybody very easily. But this is I've said in the piece this week, this is not an argument about gunboats or snipers on the channel, or one guy who phoned LBC last year and said, I know how to sort this out. Just go to Europe and buy all the dinghies. Just buy all the dinghies. That'll sort it out. And it was one of the funniest phone calls I've ever heard in my life, to be honest. The lack of understanding of so many things in society that man must have had was quite incredible. But the numbers state, ONS numbers, 1.297 million net migrants into the UK in 2 years. And my question really is, where have all those people gone? Where have they gone? Because it's largely accepted that the PRS has shrunk. But even I've tried to be as charitable as I can be in trying to define this argument. So even if we accept that it hasn't shrunk, but it's stayed the same in terms of supply, well, again, referring to Mr. Donnell of Zoopla, he suggested when he wrote about this a few weeks ago that around 90% of new migrants would come into the rental market, right? And that seems to make I don't think that's a data-based factual, but it makes sense realistically. And according to the Bank of England report I analysed last week, the average rental household is 1.25 people, which seems a bit low to me, to be honest, but I guess that makes a fair amount of sense because a lot of people are coming on their own in order to find more economic prosperity apart from anything else. And the reason why we're importing them that nobody seems to want to talk about is because we're desperate for people to do the jobs that we're not filling ourselves with our own population, of course. So you've got this huge number, and I've tried to go through every argument I could make. Have we got more HMOs? Because that would make sense, right? That would make sense. People see the opportunity, they create more HMOs. We're not very good at measuring how many HMOs we have. In fact, the only really remotely respected industry-wide figures I can find are from Octane Capital, and they're about 12 months out of date, unfortunately. But they were showing a decline in the number of HMOs, and actually 30,000 fewer HMOs in 2 years than the 2 years before. So 30,000 HMOs is going to be at least 150,000 rooms because we're talking licensed HMOs, right? So perhaps there's a load of unlicensed HMOs that are springing up and housing up to 4 people. And this is what's going on. Again, reaching, you can tell the desperation in my argument, trying to steelman the other side here. But even if we said we've added 100,000 HMO rooms to the stock in 2 years, which looks intergalactically hopeful, right? It's probably shrunk. But even if we say we had, well, that's only 80,000 households or 100,000 people that we're going to accommodate with those rooms, right? So what's going on with everything else? Has it gone? Is it purpose-built student accommodation? Well, that doesn't seem to be the case. The sector is growing incredibly slowly, about 1.25% a year. I had a look at the stats for hotels. Is it hotels? Are people making mega bucks by leasing floors or whole hotels to Serco? Again, the data lags a bit, but there was a 7% increase in occupancy rates in 2023, but that's only going up to April. But of course, that might just be the effects of COVID wearing off, apart from anything else. But interestingly, the nationwide stats for hotel occupancy, as answered by survey, are about 76%. So they're certainly already pretty well used. and the sector is growing at a tiny under 1% rate. So it's not even like hotels can suddenly house people. And then I was struck by there was a bit of fuss this week because Sunak made a comment about how they'd sorted out their asylum backlog, which was a bit of a lie, really, or at least he misspoke. And what really meant was there were 170,000 cases. Those have been solved but been replaced by another 100,000 cases in the interim. And actually, only about 70,000 of those, therefore, have been determined, 170 minus 100, right? And of those 170, around about 50,000, it's a little more than 50,000, have been approved. And this causes a big fuss because our approval rate is about 67% of an asylum application, whereas if you point to somewhere like France, you've got an approval rate of about 30%. So those who are particularly anti-migration are saying, well, ultimately, we're too liberal. But that's not my argument. My point is, when your asylum application is approved, do you realise you get 7 days then from the Home Office to say, right, you're out of your hotel accommodation or whichever former naval vessel or RAF base or wherever we've got to on that basis these days. You've got 7 days and then you're gone. And I just find that ridiculous because I would contend that any of us would struggle to get a tenancy within 7 days, particularly when at that point we surely haven't got a job yet because we've only just had our application approved, so we can only just legally work, right? So how the hell is someone going to be able to get a tenancy within 7 days? They've got no proof of income, they've got no credit history, etc., etc., etc. It just seems ridiculous. So I don't know this for a fact, but I presume that then falls upon the local authority for them to present themselves as homeless, because that's where it would. Now, I actually believe in real life that what probably happens to quite a number of those applications when they've been approved is that they then go and have to stay with perhaps friends or relatives who came from the same place perhaps years ago and have got an established rental or owned household somewhere in the UK. So they kind of get swallowed up. And this is really building up to the crux of my point, is I'm left by the end by being as optimistic as I possibly can with around about 800,000 people in the last 2 years. And I don't know where they are, right? There's a couple of 100,000 voids, again, best case scenario, that look like they've been pretty permanently filled in the private rental sector. But there's always going to be, it's a bit like unemployment. There's always going to be some, because there's always going to be some refurbishment. There's always going to be some repurposing. There's always going to be deaths and probate and this and that and the other and organic changeover. So I don't know how much more the PRS could even try to absorb, right? So the answer must be in overcrowding, right? It must be in overcrowding. And we know that if we went back to 2017 and the tragedy of the Grenfell Tower, there was already significant overcrowding that was evidenced by the number of flats that had 5 people in a 1-bed and 7 people in a 2-bed. And we know this is a problem in London and has been a historical problem. Again, the best data on this is years old, that's 3 years out of date, is the English Housing Survey. And that suggests about 560,000 overcrowded rental properties between the social sector and the PRS in the UK. So what I'm suggesting is that number might well have at least doubled since the 2021 housing survey. And again, if anybody listening can tell me what I've missed out in my analysis in there or shine a bit of light on that, I'd love to know. But my central point really is, look at the incredible amount of demand pressure there is, right, in terms of rental. That's not going away. It's not being addressed. It's not being addressed by supply. It's not going to suddenly be addressed in 2024 because it's impossible. Will the new administration be able to do anything? Even if they could build 1.5 million houses, which is what they're seeking to do, and listening to Angela Rayner, who has been on the Rest is Politics leading podcast that Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell do, and I'd highly recommend anybody goes and listens to it, because apart from anything else, I'm coming around to the belief that Ms. Rayner is going to be extremely influential in the housing market over the next 5 years or so. She sees it as quite simply more council houses need to be built. Of course, we've got to look at funding of that, but I don't think many people are not behind the idea of building more council houses. The issue has been the exit through right to buy and it never being fixed, and it's this sort of perverse thing that created a bit of a middle class opportunity for people lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time and be able to manage the sacrifices that it takes to own rather than rent, apart from anything else. The problem has been never filling the funnel back up from the top, but that's the typical problem of government. But if anyone can answer that question, if you guys have got any thoughts on where are those people? Where are these 800 odd thousand people that I can't place? Is it just overcrowding, sofa surfing, temporary accommodation, or have I missed something out?
So I can say from personal experience of being an immigrant. When I came to the UK, like my first thing was like I would always stay with friends, and I think that's what most like people from, I don't know, Eastern Europe, like that's my experience been. That we always stay with friends, we always stay like for a while with someone that we knew from the past. I guess for people coming from like and all the other kind of like Middle East and stuff, it would be the same, because I think it's a cultural thing as well, to like be helping each other and stuff like that. So I think that kind of having a requirement of having own independent house is very different to other cultures, I guess. So I'm pretty sure that a lot of it is on the overcrowding, and I don't even know where you would get all this data you were talking about, but pretty impressive research.
That's the one of the cruxes of the problem. The data is really, really poor, and that's definitely a problem. I wonder then if you think that possibly there'll be there's an argument that there is already a bit of a cultural shift in younger generations towards renting being more acceptable than it was, which is much more of a, well, both Western and Eastern European attitude than it is a British attitude, and whether that is a permanent cultural shift, not something that's necessarily forced by demographics, but just people being more. I hear about people who are in, Gen Z or possibly millennials who might inherit a property business from their parents, and that they're not really interested in it as a general rule, because they see what it is. It's hard work for the money. They feel that there's so much attacking the sector, they don't want to get involved in it really. They would rather go and work for somebody else in a job that they enjoy, and get a bit more choice and a bit more flexibility, and go and work for a tech company or do something exciting, because their parents have given them significant opportunities in terms of their education and all the rest of it, and so they can get those jobs. But I wonder if we might see a shift more towards, because I tend to think quite in a fairly heterodox manner. I would like to think I'm quite an independent thinker, and I think I do wonder. I could see loads of situations where I would live with other family members, other friends, and it makes loads of sense, because running households is a bloody expensive thing to do, right? So this sort of, it is the indigenous British that are the outliers here, really, with this "my home is my castle" sort of attitude. And it actually, the old "mi casa su casa" approach, which you've just described, makes much more sense apart from anything else. Makes much more sense. So the luxury of not being overcrowded, I don't know.
And I think also, like, once you have some people staying with you and stuff, like I think a lot of people, I don't know, all different cultures, like they would create additional places, properties, build things in the garden and all kind of things. I mean, I guess those kind of things would not be reflected in any data, because people would just be adding some sort of makeshift extensions, properties, garden houses, whatever that is.
Yeah, we know anecdotally there's a ton of those in London, and I've definitely seen more and more of those popping up, even in the leafy burbs of Solihull. So I think you're absolutely spot on. And unless you went to look at how many people have bought, if you've seen some of the modular prefab stuff that you can buy, that are generally like SIPS panels constructed or something like that, and they tend to crane them in already built. I mean, you can buy basically a 3-bed bungalow for about 100 grand that gets craned into the garden if you've got a concrete base for it. It's not supposed to have anyone permanently living there, but if you just looked at how many of those had been sold, I think that hadn't been sold to a holiday park or whatever, I think you'd have a good idea of just how much is being swallowed by exactly that sort of thing. And I think that's a very good shout, Piotr.
Yeah, Well, if the business goes bad here, then my plan B is to stay at Jay's garden house, because he built one for like 20K, and I'm sure there's like 5 of us could stay there.
Well, you need a
It
license if
is
there's 5
lovely.
of you. That's the question.
Well, I mean, this is it. And you're talking about how to kind of pull these figures together. Like, where are these missing 400,000, 800,000 people, right? It comes down to how many of those people, because whether you're coming from Europe, Africa, or the Middle East, chances are you're going to have a community, you're going to be part of a culture, and on top of that, you're probably going to be part of a religious group. So we
Mm,
focus for specifically because there's quite a bit of migration from the Middle East. I I don't know how many homeless people in the UK are Muslim. I would I would put money on it being an exceptionally very low figure. And the reason I say that is if you are a Muslim and you walk up to a mosque and you say, I have no food, I have no clothes, I have nowhere to live, they take you in and they sort that out. It's the same thing with the Sikhs and the Hindus. They pretty much do the same kind of thing. You go back a couple of hundred years, that was the same thing with the church. It's just, it's not there anymore. So let's say you make it to the UK, whether you come off a boat, a plane, or however you get here, um, and you pass through the immigration, you're given the accepted to stay, whatever it may be. Um, your solution is that you do go to the nearest religious building slash family network that you know, and how many of those people are registering for um you know um you know uh, you know voting, how many people are saying, oh, I now live here for voting purposes, or I'm paying council tax. um they're probably not, right? And that makes them invisible to a certain degree. And before they get a job, how many of them are applying for universal credit or housing benefit, or how many of them are living off the charity of the community they have around them? So it probably is the fact that most of them, apart from that they have a passport or they'll have their right to remain or right to work kind of status, apart from that, they're probably almost exclusively invisible. Um, the number of properties you see at auction, just kind of spinning it back round to some form of lived knowledge or experience, is the number of properties that you see where it says, oh, there's a tenant here, blah blah blah, and you go there and there's 15 people living in a 3-bedroom house. This isn't uncommon, and it's not just London. You see it everywhere. So I'm very much of the opinion that it's probably almost impossible to calculate where these missing hundreds of thousands of people have gone, because for the first couple of years, I imagine they're probably not on the system.
mm.
Um, that's the gut feeling. That is the gut feeling.
Brilliant. Well, Helen's suggesting we set up a Sunday special commune in Jay's garden. I think that could be start of a religion. Like there will be a church there. There'll be like.
I was just recently watching the Waco documentary over Christmas, actually, on well, not documentary. It's a bit of a it is largely based on fact, but I think Jay looks a little bit like David Koresh, actually. So
Oh God! Literally last night I was watching Hell Camp on Netflix as well, which is it's about an hour and a half long, and it's a documentary about a guy in America who was like, "Have you got an unruly teen? No problem. Give us." This was in the 80s. Give us 15,000 to $20,000. We will kidnap your child, take them to a desert in Utah. We will, we'll dry them out. There'll be no drugs and alcohol in their system, and we will break them down until they are a potentially uh, someone in society who's going to contribute rather than be a drain. And
God bless
it
America.
was
God bless
shocking.
America.
It was absolutely shocking. And then basically he got kicked out of so many states that he had to put them on a boat in international waters. And they only caught the last 5 or 6 kids when they dropped anchor in Puerto Rico. Um, and the kids kept trying to escape. I'm sorry, this is a spoiler alert. The kids kept trying to escape. So the ship captain put a noose around all of their necks and tied them into the van when they were in Puerto Rico. And when the police got into the van, they thought it was like a big drugs like thing. Just turned out it was 4 kids on a camp. Shocking behaviour, but the Waco one was really very good as well.
This from the country that also had a big business in praying the gay away, and I think probably still does in certain parts of the South. Yeah. God bless America.
And there's a great comment from Caroline as well. Maybe since COVID, more people have rented out a room. I know a few of my friends have, and I guess that's a big point, because if people have increased costs, they will look how can we increase income to some extent, and then they would utilize some of the places in their own houses. And
but obviously there's been
right.
There's been the tax encouragement side of that, up to 7.5K tax free. So I would guess, I don't know this actually, but I would guess that you still need to report that on your return if you self-assess, even if it's not a taxable event, because you'll need to report the revenue and then claim the 7,500 allowance. So in theory, HMRC might have some of that data. Of course, in theory as well, those people should be on the electoral roll, as Jay was saying. So the combined electoral roll figures should have that sort of level of data, and I'm sure that'll be right. The problem I had, Caroline, is every time I turned to, well, surely it must be this, surely it must be that, and I couldn't find the figures to support what I was theorizing. A bit like our garden sheds theory. These things all make loads of sense, and you think, sure, yeah. Well, I mean, look, one thing we know is they've got to be. Well, we probably know two things, right? One, we know these people have got to be somewhere, and they're not sleeping out on the streets, right? And two, the official figures will be an underestimate. They won't be an overestimate. They'll be an underestimate. We know this because they're always getting revised upwards, and there's an admission by the government that there's several 100,000 illegal pieces of migration that have taken place in the last 5 years. So, my numbers are on every way under-egging what the quantum of the missing people must be. And it's just, I think I was really trying to get people to get their heads around it, but also just understand where, apart from anything else, another thing that's possibly underreported, there's a lot of fuss being made these days about the low birth rate in lots of countries. Japan has got a specific problem, and Italy, and these problems are not new news. I remember at school 30 years ago in geography talking about these problems that population pyramids would have, and the UK is not in anywhere near as bad shape. And of course, Japan's very interesting because they have quite a hostile attitude towards immigration, apart from anything else. So they don't plug any of the gaps. And then look at what's happened to the Japanese economy for the last 35 years. Hasn't been the greatest in the world, although Liz Truss would disagree. But then I'm very happy to be on the other side of the fence to Liz Truss on pretty much anything. So that's no big deal. But that just shows you we've also got a fairly burgeoning pyramid of teenagers at the moment, certainly in cities in the Midlands, but in and around the UK, where these teenagers obviously will grow and get older and be in their 20s and 30s over the next 20 years. And so we've got guaranteed younger people who are much more likely, again, to want and need rental accommodation, right? So there's a huge amount of supply of potential tenants already here and coming. I mean, lots of people would have taken in, if we looked at Caroline's proposal there, you'd have to be quite mindful around the Homes for Ukraine scheme, because obviously a lot of people took Ukrainians in, and the people I know that did it were, after 6 months, fairly keen for them to move on, because they weren't used to having people live in their household, and that conversation that we've already had. And of course, they used their middle class muscle, generally speaking, to be able to get those people tenancies, so they could get them their own flat or a starter place or whatever. For Ukrainian woman and one child was quite a common story that I heard. Well, of course, that still took units out of the private rental sector, and the people who let their room and would have reported that income presumably on their tax returns in that tax year wouldn't have actually carried on taking that lodger, and actually the net effect would have been one more rental unit taken up by one Ukrainian family. So it would be, I mean, I'm sure we're right between us somewhere. It's just when it's difficult to measure, you do wonder, and you just wonder how many people are living in each household. It would be really interesting to know. officially versus unofficially, what's going on and how many people are or aren't on the radar.
Yeah,
Well, there's
yeah,
been another comment from YouTube to this one. So lots of cuckoos returning to the nest of mummy and daddy or never leaving, right? So you're probably seeing when you're expecting people to reach adulthood here in the UK that they'd go out and rent or buy or do whatever. Maybe they're not entering the PRS. So maybe there's a portion of the net migration that is filling that percentile there. That's actually a really interesting point.
I think it doesn't necessarily take away from the migration point because they won't be able to go to the mummy and daddy nest. But I do take the point. We do have to remember though, average age of a first time buyer has been going up and up and up for many years. Since the mid 2000s, apart from anything else. And so that would have to be a consideration. We've definitely lost a handful of tenants who've said they're going back to move in with family, particularly around the time when cost of living crisis was escalating so much that people were panicking, apart from anything else. And they might be lost from the PRS together forever. It makes sense if the baby boomers have got the money and the unencumbered properties, because never forget how many unencumbered properties there are out there that people own. Then it makes sense if people haven't got mortgage pressures, then someone can move back in, make a contribution towards the electricity, gas and council tax, which these days in most houses is going to come to 500 quid a month. So bear in mind, you're probably looking at a rental figure pretty much, or certainly a rental figure from 6 or 7 years ago in the provinces is now just the cost of running the household apart from anything else. So there definitely will be some of that. But one of the interesting things that made me think of was one of the underreported stats of 2023. I didn't bother with the YouTube video because I couldn't see it taking off in incredible popularity, but underreported stats of 2023. One of them was one of the greatest percentages of first-time buyers of all time since they've been keeping the records, right? Now, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that it wasn't really the pricing that kept people out, and wage rises and all the rest of it have allowed affordability to creep back in. It probably speaks to the fact that first-time buyers are still very motivated, and therefore they would pay the higher prices on the mortgages and all the rest of it. Whereas other people, it's much easier when you've already got a home to decide to not move than it is to decide to move. But I'm surprised the Conservatives didn't make more of this. Although, of course, you've got to bear in mind that overall transaction numbers were down to around about 1 million. We're going to find out what they are in a couple of months' time. So it won't be that in absolute numbers we've sold to more first-time buyers than we ever have before. But you had a very low number of new units being delivered. So you had record numbers of secondary market stock selling to first-time buyers. And you would think, generally, that would be lauded as a political victory. Although, as more and more time goes on, you find out more and more that Sunak hasn't really got a clue how to play politics in any way, shape or form. So perhaps it's unsurprising. But perhaps when Dominic Cummings comes back, then everything will be fine because he's never caused any issues at all in the past. Has he?
No, but some looks like Adam's had a little too much sherry over the Christmas holidays.
Amazing. I think this conversation about migrants and all this kind of stuff, and everyone's comments and us pondering on where those people could go. I think this highlights a lot, how much research and theoretical kind of questioning goes into this kind of stuff and your Sunday specials, because it can be a proper rabbit hole to try to find some theories, then prove it with some data, and then check if that data is actually any good, and then put it all together. Impressive.
And then don't forget to dust it off with the fact that we're all human beings, and so are immigrants, whether they're illegal or not or whatever. And to remember that, some people have crossed mountains, oceans, deserts, whatever, to find somewhere where they feel safe and they feel that they can live or raise a family or whatever.
100% agree. And
it needs that as well.
it was very reflective to me to write this piece, because as I'm coming, I didn't start with a conclusion in mind. I was just like, right, well, I got to the point where I was like, well, a significant amount of this has got to be overcrowding, and put yourself in a position where there is overcrowding. And I think Piotr put a lovely positive spin on it, where, and you see that from, what happened when the Russian incursion into Ukraine. The Polish took 1 million Ukrainians or more and let them into their homes, because, as you say, that is the cultural way, and the kindness and the opening up of their hearts. And I was really impressed to see, the Homes for Ukraine scheme was oversubscribed. There's lots of criticism of why there hasn't been a Homes for Yemen, or pick, a number of other, and those are legitimate discussions to be had. But I think what you'd find is, contrary to popular belief, you'd still find people opening their doors quite happily. It's more the decisions made at the governmental level to facilitate it, rather than to make it really difficult, which has been the Conservative mantra for the past 13 years. Make it, it made me laugh about the supposed hostile environment. A hostile environment where still nearly 1.3 million people net want to come into the country. It really does put the UK into perspective. And Jay said right at the beginning, if anybody wants to share any goals or anything they're grateful for, I'm still grateful to live in this wonderful country. And it seems that 1.3 million net people agree with me in that they would like to be here rather than to be anywhere else, generally speaking. So there are many, many things to be grateful for, but certainly, despite the best efforts of Boris Johnson and various other idiots that we could mention, there's going to be an election this year where I think the best bet at the moment looks like there being a low turnout, unfortunately, because it doesn't really seem that Keir Starmer's going to be the sort of guy who's really going to get people out on the streets with passion to vote. And the turnout figures for by-elections look low. Labour should still win, probably. But it's whenever there's low turnout, there's volatility,
Yeah, it's quite a big difference to what happens all over the world, because it seems to be like the elections all over the world attract a lot of people. Even in Poland, we had almost nearly 80% of people turning up, which normally that would be, that was 70, maybe 4 or 5, but normally it would be 38, maybe 40. But so it pretty much doubled, and it seemed like all over the world there's more at stake, or people feel more engaged with things. And in the UK, it seems quite the opposite. People are less engaged, and it's a different story.
Yeah, and the government's done some serious damage over the past few years with the pandemic in terms of how they've communicated, what they've done, the trust that wasn't really there in the first place. I dare say the government's probably less trusted in the media these days, and that would be a pretty damning indictment of what's going on. But I had a look at the YouGov do quite an interesting sort of temperature take of what are the major issues in the UK, and they also do a sentiment poll once a week. So how are you feeling? Stressed, sad, happy? There's all sorts of emotions you can choose, and it's still heartening to see that the first week of the year, everyone on an annual basis is more optimistic and more happy, generally speaking, even though we always look at the splits that have happened over Christmas, because that's what brings the deals to the market apart from anything else. And we know there is a spike in divorces, but generally speaking, that little period over Christmas does lift the nation a little bit, and there is more optimism. And I hope that, unlike people like the Halifax who are still pumping out bilge that house prices are going to fall 4% this year, most people are optimistic, and they don't let pessimism get in the way of trading, expanding their businesses, making purchasing decisions and stuff like that. Because the one thing I'll defend Boris till the end on, the one thing I liked about him was his boosterism and his positivity about the United Kingdom. And we need some more of that, and we need more of that this year, one way or another, because the way the press goes these days, it's just one crisis to the next, to the next, to the next, and you just get very sick of it, don't you?
I wanted to ask you about this, Adam. There's a lot of noise about there being a base rate drop in April, May. Do you think that will have so two-part an inflationary effect based on the points that you made earlier in the call? Do you think that will help house price sales increase in terms of volume of properties sold rather than the price that they sell for. Where do you see do you see it going down 0.25%, 0.5%? What's your gut feeling on those points?
So fabulous question, and I was really interested that probably there's an absolute sprinkling of economic forecasters that I really have any remote respect for, to be honest with you. Gary Stevenson, if no one's looked him up, he's a pretty left wing but very, very talented guy. Used to be a trader at Citibank. Capital Economics, they do a pretty good job. And I'm nearly out at that point of people that I have a deep respect for who do any forecasting of note in the marketplace. There's a lot of commentators who know what they're talking about, but it's relatively easy to commentate and say that the forecasts are wrong because they're always bloody wrong. So you know that they're going to be wrong. It's how wrong are they going to be? Capital Economics think that the base rate's not going to drop until the second half of 2024, which I think is fairly aggressive. But I think they might have written that prediction before the last 10 days of 2023, where yields really dropped quite a lot. And we've got to remember, you know, the mortgage rate is set by the bond yield, not by the base rate. So the thing that dropping the base and the bond yield is trading, you know, somewhere between nearly a full 2% and about 1.5% below the base rate at the moment. The 5-year bond yield is trading. It's had a ropey week this week. It had an incredible run before Christmas of coming down and down and down. Because there's been positive economic news, the yield tends to go up because it means that the rates can stay higher for longer. That's the conventional thinking. So to my mind, the market is determined by the bond yield rather than the base rate, although there will be that positivity of rates starting to come down. But of course, there's always a danger when rates start to come down that actually what the message that people then get is, well, wait for a bit because rates are coming down. And that can become a more self-fulfilling prophecy. Whereas if your mindset, like I would imagine a lot of the first-time buyers who bought last year, their mindset would be, let's get on with this. It's a new world now. We can afford the mortgage. We want a house. Let's get into it. And then if they think a little bit further, they might well have thought, well, do you know what? In 2 years' time, if they went for a 2-year or 5 years' time, we're probably coming off onto a lower rate, and that'll be great. And we're willing to put in that sacrifice for the first 5 years in order to get something we really want, which is our first house that we've bought. So my personal feeling is rates will come down in the second quarter of this year. I didn't fancy the March bet, and I said as much before Christmas. There was a 50-50 bet at one point that rates would come down by March, and I was thinking, look, you've still got 3 people on the Monetary Policy Committee who want to put the rate up, not sideways. They want to go to 5.5. And they're central bankers. They don't do anything in a hurry. It takes them 45 minutes to get dressed in the morning, right? They do not hurry for anybody. So don't think that this is going to happen in a particularly knee-jerk way unless there's a significant black swan style event, which just doesn't look on the cards at the moment. So economy looks a bit more positive than it did. And I think that my bets are on second quarter, but I think 4.25-ish by the end of the year looks good. Could easily be 4.5 in terms of the base rate. I think the bond yield, I made the argument last year, it's kind of got to trade in the range of sort of 3.5 to 4, trending down towards 3.5 at the end of the year. It then made me look like a melon because it went down to 3.3 before Christmas. Although this week it's back up to 3.65. And I think 3.3 was, you know, unreasonably low, realistically. I don't see how we can really... There's people saying we're going to go below 3% relatively quickly. Well, we did see 2.83% in February 23, which a lot of people will have forgotten because it suddenly went on a complete tear as soon as Russia set foot into Ukraine. So it is possible for it to go below 3. But then, of course, at the time of February 23, base wasn't 5.25 and people weren't expecting base to be 5.25. So I think the Bank of England are saying, and they have been relatively consistent, the rate hasn't gone up as high as the market thought it would thus far. There's still enough in the, you know, UK core inflation is still 5.1. So my points around CPI earlier on, you've got to bear those in mind. And you've got to look at core, but you've also got to look at core for the last 3 months and 6 months. And that will tell you it's much calmer. It's around about the 2 to 2.7 mark is more accurate in terms of where we are right now. But my argument is there's more inflationary things potentially happening in the next few months than there are disinflationary things. So I still think the higher for longer could be realistic. And I do think one of the things that I gave a little hat tip to this week in the supplement I didn't mention is how much money has been made by people who had savings that nobody necessarily saw coming, because people had fixed debt at low rates, and a lot of people and corporates, in terms of the quantum of the debt, not necessarily in terms of the number of the people, but a huge amount of debt was fixed in January 2022, apart from anything else. And as you guys know, last year I was massively 2022, sorry, I was massively banging the drum for breaking your mortgages and fixing them for exactly this reason. Well, that's great. But if you then had savings, suddenly you got, and I know this from my own tax return, for the first time in many years, I had to consider, have I had too much, interest income from money that's been sitting around in accounts throughout the year, because that's been sort of, fluid funds or whatever, because suddenly there's actually been an interest rate on that money for the first time in many years. And so people have made more money from the savings rates going up than they've lost money from the debt pricing going up. Now, of course, at some point that changes because people drop off the debt rates. How quickly? We know that probably 600,000 or 700,000 more people will drop off their fixed mortgages by the time we get to the middle of the year. But then if they can go on to a 4% deal rather than what looked like it could be a 6% deal at certain points last year, it'll make a huge, huge difference. And of course, they've had a number of pay rises in the interim, including probably another fairly healthy one this year as well. So let's see. So hopefully that's a fairly rounded and robust answer to that question, Jay, but it's a really good one. It's a really good one.
Yeah, it'll be so good to come back to this recording in December and be like,
for sure. Hey, look, I'm up for holding myself accountable, mate. No problem. I'm there to be shot at.
Amazing. Really good. Well, we're coming to the end of today's episode, and I wanted to also post a couple of ways that people can continue watching the content that we all produce. So this is our new YouTube channel with Saif and Omar, where we put our reviews of auction properties in. It's Property Auction Hunters, and we release a video every week, Monday 7 p.m. And if
I've been loving the action so far, guys. It's been fabulous. Lovely chat. Really entertaining.
It's really good fun.
Yeah, it's super fun, and it's and we should add the money element to who's guessing the right prices and stuff, but coming soon. And Adam's channel, Proponomics with Adam Lawrence. It was Proponomics not available.
So Proponomics was available, but for whatever reason I decided to go for a longer effort. But I've started doing I've made a pledge to do some daily content this year, although some of it is only shorts. So I'm trying to round up a bit more about some of the macro figures that I use to put into the supplement. I'm also doing a weekly video on a Wednesday that I'm releasing around my 4 pillars of property investment strategic framework. So it's a series I've been meaning to put together properly for some time. One a week is achievable, and I hope that then I'll have enough to be able to tie it all together into a book at some point, probably in 2025, but maybe by the end of 24. Let's see.
Amazing.
No New Year's resolutions on books. None of that. It takes a lot of time. It doesn't make any money, as you guys know. So useful to have. Nice idea. But yeah. I'm already at the end before I'm at the beginning of that one. So let's see what happens.
Amazing. So yeah, if you don't have enough of us on Sunday mornings, you can have us Monday evenings and Wednesdays and Fridays and 24/7 really. So yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in and putting comments and engaging in these conversations about research on migrants and where they stay. And we'll be back next week with more content, and hopefully with Helen joining the team. Brilliant.
Pray for Helen's internet, everyone. Pray for Helen's internet. Come on.
Yes.
Guys. Anyway, I'll speak to you next week.